We just bring up some.
May I have Counselor Twitch? You may be seated.
Yes, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
I represent Keith Sandy.
Yes, sir.
Are you getting paid for this testimony?
No, sir.
What is your opinion on whether Keith Sandy was justified in shooting Mr. Boyd?
My opinion is that he was justified in shooting Mr. Boyd.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you, Your Honor.
Any cross? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. McCarthy, you've spent your lifetime in law enforcement. Is that right, sir?
From the time I was 23.
And you're now 78?
I have been in law enforcement until 1993. But I've worked around law enforcement beyond that, yes.
Yes, sir. And even now, your current job is consulting and training law enforcement officers?
Yes.
And you work for a company that sells law enforcement equipment to...
No, I did, but I don't.
Oh,
no.
Anymore. All right. And also you have family members who are in law enforcement. Is that right, sir?
Yes, I do.
And one of the reasons you're doing this for free is because you care about law enforcement officers. Is that right?
I care about good ones, yes.
All right. And you would agree with me, sir, that, well, you've only, in all the cases that you've testified as an expert witness, you always, 99% of the time, testify in favor of the police officer, don't you, sir?
I've only testified on behalf of a plaintiff 4 times now.
Yes, sir. And that means the other 99% of the time, it's for a police officer. Is that right, sir?
That's correct.
To defend the police officer's conduct.
Yes.
You would agree with me that society gives police a huge amount of power. Is that right, sir?
Judge, irrelevant, sir.
Completely relevant, Judge.
Yes, they do.
They are allowed to openly carry handguns and long guns in our society, are they not, sir?
Yes, they do.
And they have a limited license to shoot people if need be. Is that right?
The license being the law is what you're referring to?
Yes, sir. And that limited license to kill has prescribed rules on what is and is not appropriate. Isn't that right, sir?
Yes.
You're not allowed to kill just to kill, are you, sir?
No.
It has to be done within the rules of engagement for law enforcement officers. Is that right?
Within the law and within the laws of the state and the federal government. No.
Yes, sir. And if an
Yes.
officer steps over the line, you would agree with me that he or she should be held accountable, wouldn't you, sir?
I do.
Now, I understood your testimony to say that officers could only shoot if there was an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. They can't shoot if there's only a potential threat. Isn't that right, sir?
That's correct. It must be immediate or imminent.
And there is a difference between a potential threat and an imminent threat, isn't there, sir?
In my mind, yes.
Anybody could be a potential threat, right?
Well, most people are nice, fortunately, but I know what you mean, and yes, that could be taken to the extreme and say anybody could be a potential threat, but 4-year-olds in kindergarten aren't. I've never seen one that I was threatened by.
All right, well, maybe I should say every adult can be a potential threat, and even teenagers can be a potential
Male
threat.
adults primarily, yes, we have a problem.
A woman reaching into her purse during a traffic stop could be a potential threat?
I would need far more information than that.
Okay. A teenager?
Especially if it's a woman, because women are very unlikely to attack police officers. They're not the ones that do it.
All right, it's men that you see more as a potential threat, is that right, sir?
Oh, obviously, yes. Now women have, but it's very unusual.
A teenager with his hand in his pocket?
That the witness be allowed to finish the answer before again jumped in.
I'm sorry, go ahead, ma'am.
A teenager with a hand in his pocket could be a potential threat?
Under severe circumstances, yes.
A neighbor with a gun in his pocket could be a potential threat?
Under severe circumstances, yes.
And a mentally ill person ranting about the government and threatening to kill people could be a potential threat. Is that right, sir?
You left out hand in the pocket.
I don't have
If
hand in the
he's
pocket on that one.
If he's just ranting and raving, then he's not a threat at all. No.
Okay. In none of those situations, based on those facts alone, is an officer authorized to shoot someone. Is that right?
I would agree.
Okay. And you're aware that the Albuquerque Police Department was trained on something called the reactive control model. And, Your Honor, could I have the demo, please? And you've seen this, have you not? Sir, this is State's Exhibit 59, Your Honor, that's been admitted. And you can't see it yet, but it's coming, Mr. McCarthy.
Yes, I've seen this.
This is the model that Chief Eden testified these officers were trained under. Were you aware of that, sir?
Yes.
And I want to direct your attention to this column, the armed assailant column, and ask you about where the line is for this particular column. Let me get a different piece of papers. Let me blow that up a little bit. Based on the training of the Albuquerque police officers, there is a column on the left-hand side for armed and threatening. Do you see that, sir?
Yes.
And the response, according to this reactive control model, is verbal warnings. Isn't that right, sir?
Yes.
Show of force.
Yes, that's what it says.
You can draw your firearm. Is that right?
Yes.
And cover, distance, assistance, retreat. Those are the options given under that particular scenario. Isn't that right, sir?
Yes.
And the column for when you can respond with a use of force, firing weapon to stop an attack, is this column on the other side of this line here. Yeah, I'm sorry, I just realized it too. Those are all my notes you got. They will see all my questions. Let me flip this over, Judge. Let me flip this over. And when you can use force or fire your weapon to stop an attack, first of all, that's what it says. That's when you can fire your weapon to stop an attack. Isn't that what it says, sir?
That's what it says there.
And above here it says when you can fire your weapon is if you have an armed attack. Do you see that, sir?
Yes.
And below it, on that side of the line, it says closes distance. Do you see that, sir?
Yes.
And you understand that's the training that the Albuquerque Police Department was given, don't you, sir?
That's one of the training factors they've been given, yes.
Okay, and that is consistent with what SWAT Sergeant James Fox testified about, that you can only shoot when a subject is coming at you. Is that right, sir? Oh, I guess you weren't aware of that. Or were you here for Sergeant Fox's?
I was not here for his testimony, but you can shoot when a subject isn't coming at you. They don't have to be coming at you. I would disagree with that.
Well, I'll talk to you about that in just a second. Is coming at you the same as an attack?
If you have a weapon, I would say that the weapon and coming towards you, and you have to have other factors, but yes,
okay, but
that
you,
would
and I'm sorry, were you done?
Constitute an attack.
Okay. You have proposed to this jury that there can be an anticipatory shooting. Is that right?
Under circumstances that are consistent with ethics and reasonable judgment on the part of the officer, yes.
Okay. And your example that you gave to this jury was the fellow who was just walking down the street, reached under his sweatshirt, and the police officer, Officer Kelly, shot him. Is that right?
Yes, but I described more circumstances than that.
Oh, yes, sir. I understand
Yes.
that. And you said when he lifted it up, in fact, there was the gun, right?
Correct.
If they had lifted up the sweatshirt and there was a cell phone, would you have felt the same about that shooting?
Yes.
Okay.
Under the circumstances that were there, yes.
Okay, so you don't draw the line here where the reactive control model has it. You would move the line over here and let police officers shoot somebody whenever they anticipated there might be force used against them. Is that right?
No. You're saying where there might be, and there has to be more to it than that. There has to be circumstances that are extremely compelling for the officer to react, like there was in Seattle, Washington.
You understand that by allowing officers to anticipate an attack rather than waiting for an attack, that police may end up shooting citizens who act defensively or out of fear, but we're not really going to attack the police. Is that right, sir?
I wouldn't agree with that. The majority of shootings that happen when our reasonable judgment utilized are lawful shootings. The great majority are.
Yes, sir, but some of them are not, isn't that right?
There are some that are shootings driven out of mistake or fear, or the person shouldn't have been a cop in the first place.
Right. Some are driven by a police officer who has a heavy badge. Is that right, sir?
I have met egotistical or arrogant police officers that are badge heavy, and they are a potential to get in trouble, yes.
All right. Potential danger to the community, are they not, sir?
They're a danger to everybody around them, including other officers, yes.
And same is true for a police officer with something to prove to the rest of the police officers about how tough he is?
I would say I've seen that, yes.
And that is a risk to everybody on the street, that kind of officer, isn't it, sir?
If that officer is like that, he's a problem and a risk to
All right.
himself, the citizenry, and other officers.
Shouldn't be on the force, should he, sir?
No,
All right.
he should not.
The most important goal in your training is, I think you said number 1 was citizen safety.
Citizen safety is the first priority, yes.
Number 2, safety of officers.
And then the safety of the officers involved.
And then 3, not violating a subject's constitutional rights. Is that right?
That's correct.
Was Mr. Boyd considered a citizen in this case?
He was considered a suspect in this case, a suspect who was supposed to submit to arrest for a serious felony offense.
Okay, it would never be appropriate for an officer to deliberately place himself in danger in order to get to use force on a person, would it, sir?
Objection relevance.
Would you say that again, please? I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. It would never be appropriate. Oh, I'm sorry, Judge. Do you want to roll first? Okay. It would never be appropriate for an officer who wanted to shoot somebody to ever deliberately put himself in danger so he could say you were a threat and then shoot you, would it, sir?
Objection relevance.
It would be.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Let me ask you about the Tueller drill, because you're familiar with that, are you not, sir?
Yes.
The idea of the Tueller principle is that it will take some time to draw your handgun from your holster, pull it up, obtain a sight picture, pull the trigger, and fire, and adequately place a round. Isn't that right, sir?
Yes, and it's connected to distance and time.
Yes, sir. And the amount of time it takes to do that, according to Sergeant Dennis Tueller from Utah, is consistent with a distance of about 21 feet if the person is running at you. Is that right, sir?
That's what he uses, yes.
Okay. And part of what is taught with that principle is that you have to have time to perceive what is happening and react to it. Is that right?
That's correct. Perception, reaction.
Right. And it is also taught that a person's perception will be different based on whether they are expecting something to happen or not. Is that right?
I would agree with that.
If Tueller talks about a 21-foot zone of danger that a person can cover before you can draw your sidearm and fire, we know that it's got to be a shorter distance that you can have reaction and perception time if you've got your gun already out. Isn't that right, sir?
That's correct.
And the idea is to encourage officers that when there's someone with a knife to be on the low ready, I think. Is that right? Or the high ready?
I would suggest low ready.
Okay. And long guns, like the rifles in this case, are more accurate weapons than a handgun. Is that right?
Generally speaking, the longer sight radius makes them more accurate.
They have a more significant impact on the person you are shooting than does a handgun, do they not?
Generally, yes.
Okay, and if the 21-foot rule applies for a gun that's holstered, you would agree with me that, I'm sorry, sure, can I put this up? All right. Would you agree with me that a person who has a rifle out can be closer and still be within a safe distance with the person with a knife?
And be a safe distance?
Well, let me ask it this way. a person can't outrun a bullet, can they?
No.
All right. And so if you have your gun out, or if you have a long gun out, you can be closer than 21 feet and still not be at an unsafe distance. Isn't that right, sir?
That's oversimplification, so I can't agree with it.
Okay.
What exhibit is that? I don't know if that's.
This is our demonstrative aid. I'm not sure.
Has that been admitted, Your Honor?
No, it hasn't.
I'm going to object to showing it to everybody before it's ever been admitted, removed, or laid foundation.
I'll be glad to mark it in a minute, Judge. I think it was a
Now she's actually put it for the jury.
If you give me a moment, I'll address it. Ms. McGinn, turn it around.
All right, yes. Okay, Judge. The Tueller principle doesn't say that if I have knives in my hand and I'm 9 feet or 12.9 feet away from you, you get to shoot me. That's not the Tueller principle, is it, sir?
No, there's many things that you have to consider for that.
Okay,
If somebody is 12 feet away from me and they're 90 years old with a cane in their other hand, that changes. So what you're talking about in terms of these concepts are generalities. You have to have all the information.
Okay, the Tueller principle is just a tool for an officer to understand potential threats and to be ready for those threats. Is that right, sir?
I think that's the goal of the principle, yes.
Okay, and you believe that Officers Hernandez and McDaniel, the two open spaces officers who came out, did the right thing by creating distance with Mr. Boyd when he pulled his knives. Is that right?
They had a distance, and when he pulled his knife, they drew their weapons, and they didn't close on him, and that was the right thing to do. I think they took a step or two back at the time, yes.
I'm sorry, sir. You didn't realize they pulled their weapons out before he ever pulled out the knives?
Yes, when they told him to take his hands out of his pockets.
One second.
And now I've forgotten the question too. That's okay. I'll try a new one. When the open space officers approached Mr. Boyd, they pulled out their guns before he ever pulled out his knives. Isn't that right, sir?
Yes, when
All right.
he didn't respond to their commands.
Okay. In 11 seconds. Is that right,
I
sir?
believe that was approximately right, yes.
Okay. And then they spun him around to frisk him after he asked them not to touch him. Is that right, sir?
Yes, this thing.
Okay. After he asked them not to touch him, they went to frisk him. Is that right, sir?
They went to frisk him?
Yes, sir. They went to touch him, to frisk him. They were up close to him and were about to frisk him. Is that right?
I don't recall that. I thought they were at a distance from him, and they had a conversation with him, and that continued, and I didn't know that they got close to him.
Okay. They were within. You weren't aware that they were within arm's length of him, sir?
I did not know.
All right.
I thought they maintained a distance.
And there was two of them and one of him at that point. Is that right?
Yes.
And when he pulled out his knives, when he was within arm's length of them, their response was to create distance. Is that right, sir?
Yes.
And that
I'm
was
assuming that now because I didn't know they closed. So
Okay.
if they closed, then they created distance, yes.
And that was the right thing to do, was it not, sir?
For his benefit, yes. That's what they did is a good maneuver on their part.
Okay. You give training in use of force, do you not, sir?
Yes.
And you were kind enough to give us one of your PowerPoint presentations on use of force. And you believe in the training that you give to officers?
Yes, I do.
You teach officers that they may use reasonable force. Excuse me just a second, Judge. Can you put this back on here, too? Okay.
You wanted the Elm one?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Judge. You teach officers that it is never acceptable for an officer to use force simply to punish a person for their previous actions, don't you, sir?
Yes,
And you can't use force because you're mad at things somebody's saying to you as an officer on the street, can you, sir?
that's totally wrong. You shouldn't do it.
Right. And if somebody's calling you names on the street, you don't get to shoot them, do you, sir?
No, and you don't get to use force because they call you names either.
Okay, and that's in your lesson plan, and you teach officers that?
Well, I don't know how it's in my lesson plan. It's not stated exactly that way, but that's what we teach, yes.
All right. And it is never acceptable for an officer to use force on a person who is surrendering to them, is it, sir?
Not if he's surrendering in the appropriate way, yes. Not if he's surrendering with a gun in his hand, they wouldn't let him surrender that way.
All right. If someone is surrendering and no longer a threat, it is not appropriate to use force on them, is it, sir?
I would agree.
And that's what you train officers, including SWAT officers, isn't that right?
That's correct.
And officers are never justified in using deadly force in a reckless manner, disregarding the safety of themselves, other officers, or innocent bystanders, are they, sir?
In the context that you're saying it, I think I understand what you mean. If somebody is shooting in a school and killing kids, officers are supposed to recklessly and quickly enter the school, run to the sound of the guns, and stop the shooting. So it depends on the circumstance. There's a place where officers are supposed to be tactically careful and utilize time, and then there's a place when they're supposed to take care of citizen safety first, and their safety is totally disregarded. It's over. They do what they're supposed to do according to what I said, citizen safety first.
Officers are never justified in using deadly force in a reckless manner, are they, Mr. McCarthy?
No, they should not use deadly force or any force in a reckless manner.
All right. And you talked a little bit about knives being a deadly weapon and a threat as serious as guns. And I want to show you a slide from your PowerPoint presentation. Let me pull this out.
I put this on the PowerPoint, can you remove it?
Judge, it's cross-examination.
It's not an exhibit.
That's correct. It's impeachment.
May I see it before you?
Yes, Your Honor. Sure.
Can I see it?
You can all.
Okay, Mr. McCarthy?
I'm sorry?
Are you okay?
Yes.
Ready to go? Okay. In your training program, you give statistics on how many officers were murdered over a 10-year period of time, do you not, sir?
Yes.
And between the years of 1995 to 2004, there were 594 officers murdered, is that right?
Yes.
And only 7 of them were killed by assailants using knives, isn't that right?
That's my understanding, yes.
Oh, all right. I think you talked a little bit with the jury about how you can look at a person's past to determine their future behavior. Is that what you said?
Past behavior does predict future behavior is kind of a general statement that doesn't apply to everything and everybody, but
Okay, but that's what you said on direct, is that
Yes.
right? And you can't shoot a man or woman based on their past history, can you?
no, but you would be wise to take their past history into consideration if you're trying to arrest them and they've exhibited violence against police.
Yes, sir. My question was simply, you can't shoot them, walk up and shoot them based on their past history,
No,
can you,
you
sir?
can't.
Oh, all right. I just want to know where your line is, sir. On this day, March
Objection
16th.
to the characterization of his testimony.
I'm gonna ask the council, just ask questions.
Okay, Judge. On this day, March 16th, 2014, the police had 2.5 hours of observable past behavior with Mr. Boyd, did they not, sir?
That isn't accurate.
They came out at 10 minutes to 5 and they shot him at 7:33.
Objection, Your Honor, it's a mischaracterization of the evidence. They, who are we talking about?
But as to they, also stand
APD officers, the first contact with APD officers was at 10 minutes to 5 and he was shot at 7:33. And that's a little over 2.5 hours that some of the officers could observe his behavior. Is that right, sir?
I would object to the mischaracterization of the timing as well, Your Honor. That's not what the evidence is.
Frankly, I don't remember.
Okay.
I thought it was, you indicating when they arrived?
Right, that's not consistent with what
I
the
think
evidence is, Your
the
Honor.
precise time is 4:48, Judge. So 10 minutes, about 10 minutes to 5, and they shot him at 7:33.
If you're approximating, go
Right.
ahead and ask the question.
Okay. So that's a little over 2.5 hours, sir?
Yes, but they had more experience in that. They knew who he was, they knew his past, they knew he had been violent against the police before and had been arrested and convicted for that. So there's more than just that 2 hours involved here.
I understand that, sir, and I understand that that's what you testified to in direct, but I want to focus on the 2.5 hours of observable behavior on this day, March 16th of 2014. Okay?
And you want to forget the rest, that's okay with me, fine.
Well, no, sir. No, sir.
I can't even hear what
Okay.
Mr. Freeman's saying.
I said objection argumentative, Your Honor, at the time.
Okay. Can we focus on that 2.5 hour period right now, Mr.
Okay.
McCarthy?
Objection argumentative again.
That's not. During that 2.5 period of 2 hours and 40-minute period of time, they observed Mr. Boyd pull out his knives on a number of occasions. Is that right, sir?
Yes, sir.
About
Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry.
About 6 occasions during that time period?
Approximately, yes.
All right. And when he would pull them out is when he felt threatened. Isn't that right, sir?
Objection calls for speculation.
He would pull them out when they asked him to take his knives away. Is that right?
He would pull them out when he chose to pull them out. I don't know what his motivation was every time he pulled them out, but he pulled them out, and that obviously is a threat.
And he would hold them about the same way every time, about waist high, like I'm doing with right now. Is that right, sir?
Yes, he would hold them waist high, but not in a supplicating position, but more in a weapons position.
Right. He never slashed or stabbed any of the officers, did he, sir?
He did not slash or stab any of the officers.
And after a few minutes of having his knives out on each occasion, he would put them back in his pockets, would he not, sir?
Yes, he did.
And during the hour and 10 minutes with CIT Officer Mike Monette, Officer Monette was able to get him to stop taking his knives out altogether, wasn't he, sir?
Judge, that's a mischaracterization.
I'll rephrase. After the first 22 minutes of him being there, Officer Monette was able to keep Mr. Boyd from taking his knives out at all. Isn't that right, sir?
Objection. Mischaracterization of the evidence.
It is not, Judge. I think that was Officer Monette's testimony. Let me ask the question again for you, Mr. McCarthy, because you're looking confused there. Within the first 22 minutes of Officer Monette's contact with Mr. Boyd, he convinced Mr. Boyd to put his knives away, didn't he, sir?
He did put his knives away, yes, and I'm assuming that Monette had something to do with that.
And he also was able to convince him to stop even putting his hands in his pockets because Monette told him that was making them nervous. Isn't that right, sir?
Objection. Mischaracterization of the evidence, Your Honor.
It's not, Judge.
No.
You can answer, sir.
Wait one second.
I'm sorry, Judge. Did you rule?
The last part of the sentence, for the question is where I'm going to sustain that.
Okay. He was able to, and I don't know what the last part is, so can I re-ask, Judge?
Yeah, so the question is, he was also able to convince him to stop even putting his hands in his pockets.
Okay. Was Officer Monette able to get Mr. Boyd to stop putting his hands in his pockets, sir?
That may have been something that he accomplished, or it may have been a decision on Boyd. It's hard to say.
And Officer Monette got him to stop threatening the officers, didn't he, sir?
Same objection.
Not to my knowledge. He's still a threat to the police officers when he refuses to submit to arrest, refuses to disengage himself from the weapons, and will not comply with the police and be arrested.
I'm sorry,
I'll withdraw my
my question, well, of course, because he gave that answer. I think my question was maybe inarticulate, Mr. McCarthy. My question is, after Officer Monette spent 22 minutes with Mr. Boyd, he got Mr. Boyd, during the time he was there, to stop threatening the officers' lives verbally, didn't you, sir?
I would assume that he had something to do with that, yes.
Okay, and things calmed down so much that all of the field officers were able to felt confident enough to put all their guns away, except for the one cover officer.
Mischaracterization of the evidence, Your Honor.
I'll be glad to show you, Mr. McCarthy.
I'm going to allow the question.
Mr. McCarthy, let me show you what's marked as states 13 I-1. At this point in time, do you see that all of the field officers, except the one cover officer up here, have put their firearms away?
They have not put them away. They have placed them in a position where they have immediate access. They're holding them with rifles with two hands, with the muzzle pointed downwards. Some have their weapon, it appears holstered. I can't honestly tell because their backs are to us. So they are not aiming their weapons at him. They have them in a non-threatening position.
Yes, sir. Do you see any
Yes.
officer with their handgun out there?
With their handgun out?
Yes, sir.
I can't
Their
tell.
sidearm?
I don't think so, but there's an officer there that I can see three officers, and I can't tell if they have a handgun out or not.
Okay. Why? I think you've told the jury you have to believe Mr. Boyd when he says he's going to kill somebody. Do you have to believe Mr. Boyd when he says he's going to walk down and not hurt anybody?
That depends on the context in which it's said and what's going on at the time. If you've got 10 or 15 seconds of verbalization from him that appears to be on the friendly side, and you've got a couple of hours of conversation on his that's the opposite of that, then you're going to be concerned that he's not doing what he says, and he is an emotionally disturbed person who's armed. So there's nothing to indicate here that he's going to surrender, or he could have.
And so
Nothing.
So when he said, "I'm going to walk down with you, and I'm not going to hurt you. I'm a lover of people," the police officer should not have believed any of that he said. Is that right, sir?
Well, believe no. Should they take it into consideration? Yes. Now he can put the knives down, like they said, and walk down, and he would have been taken into custody.
Do you know what he said right before he turned to his left and was shot, sir?
I do not. What Boyd said right before he turned,
Yes, sir.
I have no idea. Don't know. I don't recall it.
Don't make fun of people. Do you take that to be a threatening thing, sir?
I don't take it to mean anything other than what it said. He doesn't want somebody to make fun of him.
After Officer Monette was called away and replaced with Rope and the canine officers, things escalated with Mr. Boyd, did they not, sir?
They did, yes.
And that's not a surprise based just on the optics of the different kinds of officers that replaced him. Is that right, sir? Do you understand that question, Mr. McCarthy?
It's to be expected from a paranoid schizophrenic who is unpredictable and armed and refusing to submit to arrest. His deportment is not surprising.
Well, it's not just for a schizophrenic, but do you think that an ordinary person would be concerned if the officers who were just in uniform were replaced by people in full SWAT gear, like Jeff McFarland?
I know of nothing that would tell me that a police officer's uniform is the kind of equipment that he's wearing is what generates a subject failing to cooperate or to be violent.
I'm sorry, so you don't think there's a difference in a reaction of a person on a fear level between this kind of officer and this kind of officer showing up?
Somebody could take that as a scary sight if they happen to have a particular attitude regarding the police that could be very impactful to somebody who has a particular perspective on the police. Certainly, the officer has to wear the equipment that he's given in order to respond and do his job. And again, I'll say I don't know of a circumstance where the police uniform created a subject refusing to the lawful directions of a police officer and surrendering to arrest.
In addition, I'm sorry, are you finished, Mr. McCarthy? I didn't mean to interrupt you,
I just
sir.
wanted to say I don't know of a circumstance where the uniform created a difficulty in a subject surrendering.
Okay, this doesn't indicate to you an escalation of force on the other side for somebody showing up like this, replacing somebody who's just in a regular police uniform like this?
There is no such thing in my experience where an officer wearing tactical gear is an escalation of force. An escalation of force would be something the officers are doing. It's a change in the tactical dynamics here, but it's not a use of force to show up in a tactical uniform.
Okay, so you can't understand how any person, not just someone suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, might be more afraid of a tactical officer than a regular uniformed officer who's just talking to them?
I can agree with that in the sense that when you see an officer that has a rifle and other equipment that a patrol officer doesn't have, that it would cause them to understand that there is an elevation in the police response, but that in and of itself isn't a use of force.
Okay, in addition to that, in addition to this officer that showed up in tack gear, they also showed up with 2 canine dogs, did they not, sir?
Yes.
There's been a change in philosophy over the years about who should be negotiating with the mentally ill people or emotionally disturbed people, hasn't there, sir?
Would you repeat that, please?
Sure. In police work, there's been a change in philosophy over the years about what kind of person should be negotiating with somebody who is mentally ill or emotionally disturbed.
Generally, I would agree with that.
And SWAT began changing its tactics, I think, at the end of your career to start training people in crisis negotiation to deal with mentally ill people. Did they not?
Crisis negotiations training has been around since Dr. Harvey Schlossberg developed it for the New York Police Department way back in the late 60s, early 70s.
Okay.
And so it's not new, and the change has been, rather than just train negotiators, they also train field police officers in verbal strategies.
Yes, sir. And what has been changed in the police department is they are training more police officers in those kinds of crisis negotiation or crisis intervention skills, are they not?
Yes.
And were you aware that APD had a crisis negotiations team that was associated with its SWAT unit?
Am I aware if they have a crisis
Yes, sir.
negotiations team? It's my understanding they do.
All right, and those people are specially trained to help de-escalate a situation with a mentally ill person, aren't they, sir?
Yes, they have that training also.
And they also have a psychologist that comes with the crisis negotiation team. Is that
Here
right?
in Albuquerque, they do, yes.
And they never had a chance to activate their crisis negotiation team on the night of March 16th, 2014, did they?
They did not activate it, no.
Because after SWAT Sergeant Fox arrived at 7:20, the trio of Ingram, Weimerskirch, and Sandy moved up on Mr. Boyd and asked him to pick up his bags and come down the mountain. Isn't that right, sir?
Objection, mischaracterization of the evidence.
Sustained.
Were you aware that after SWAT Sergeant Fox arrived at 7:20, that the trio, the two rope officers and the canine officers, moved from one position about midway up the mountain right up next to Mr. Boyd?
Right up next to Mr. Boyd?
Yes, sir. From where
Right.
they began to deploy the flashbang, to the area which they deployed the flashbang.
Well, next to Mr. Boyd to me means they're standing next to him. They were down the hill about 30 or 35 feet when they deployed the flashbang, is
Okay.
my understanding.
Yes, sir. Were you aware that they moved from a position at midpoint on the mountain up to that location right before they deployed the flashbang?
Yes.
Were you aware that Sergeant Weimerskirch asked Mr. Boyd to pick up his bags and come down the mountain?
I know he asked him to come down the mountain. Yes.
Okay. There is a difference between military and police work, is there not, sir?
Yes,
And you do training in both fields, do you not?
I have, yes.
Law enforcement should approach both techniques, tactics, problems, and situations in a much different way than the military, shouldn't they, sir?
Yes.
And even though some police weapons are similar to military weapons, the targets are different between a military target and a target in civilian life. Is that right?
Are you talking about targets on the range, ma'am?
You're right, my question is bad, Mr. McCarthy. In the military, the people you may shoot at are considered the enemy, isn't that right,
Objection,
sir?
relevance, Your Honor.
Sir, you talked about sympathetic fire, and you're not saying that there haven't been times when groups of officers have engaged in sympathetic fire and fired more than one shot. Are you, sir?
No, I'm not suggesting that's just been what usually happens. If it's an unintentional round, sympathetic fire, it's a bang, usually.
Okay. And in the military, that's a phenomenon that's known in the military. It's sympathetic fire, isn't that right, sir?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
There have been situations where a whole group of officers will all unload their weapons into a particular vehicle, for example.
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
You talked about flashbangs, and was your explanation that Mr. Boyd was just impervious to the flashbang? Is that your explanation for why this didn't have an effect on him?
No, he drew his knives when the flashbang went off.
Yes, sir, but the reason why you said he didn't have a reaction, the typical reaction to the flashbang, is because he was impervious because of his mental condition to the flashbang?
I don't know why he didn't. He didn't do what 70% of the people do and go to the ground.
Right.
It's not. I'm not able to say exactly why he didn't.
Okay,
He just didn't.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. McCarthy, because I thought you told this jury that it was because of his mental condition that he was impervious to the flashbang. Is that not what you said to this
I'm
jury?
suggesting that that was the reason, yes.
Okay, well, there's another explanation, is there not, sir? First of all, 30% of the time, almost a third of the time, people do not go to the ground when there's a flashbang. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
If you throw the flashbang in a place that absorbs the shock, it will not have an effect on the person because the shock's absorbed. Is that right, sir?
It's going to limit the activity of the distraction device in its ability to cause the desired effect on the part of a target person that you're focusing on.
Yes, sir. If I threw a flashbang behind the witness stand and it blew up, that wooden part would protect anybody standing here from that flashbang. Isn't that right? Isn't that right, sir?
It would protect people?
It would.
It would shield them from its effects, yes.
Correct, sir. And were you aware there was a big rock right between Mr. Boyd and the flashbang?
Yes.
And couldn't that rock have absorbed the shock of the flashbang and kept it from having any impact on Mr. Boyd?
Would limit the potential for it having an effect on Mr. Boyd, yes.
Okay. We watched this video of defendant Perez, and on the video there was the words, "finger comes off the receiver." Did you see those words on the video, sir?
Yes.
And that happened, what you're watching actually when Mr. Perez does that is you're watching him make the decision to shoot Mr. Boyd, are you not, sir?
He's coming to that conclusion, in my opinion, yes.
And this was not a mistake on defendant Perez's part, was it, sir?
It was not a mistake, in my opinion. It was
Right.
not a mistake
And
on
it
his
was
part, no.
it was not an accident that he shot Mr. Boyd.
No, not in my opinion.
He did it intentionally, didn't he, sir?
Yes,
And you can watch him make the intentional decision to do that.
yes.
And on this film, when they showed finger off the receiver, his finger came off the receiver, and that was an indication that he was getting ready to shoot. Is that right, sir?
Yes.
That happened before Mr. Boyd ever pulled out his knives, didn't it, sir?
That happened when Mr. Boyd was standing in the position he was in, and it was simultaneous with knives in split seconds and the closing of the people that he's sworn to protect. And so it's all happening, and you can't separate it out in the sense that it's happening within tenths of a second. All of it is happening within tenths of a second.
Yes,
The
sir.
finger, the closing, the reaching for the knives.
Yes.
And we're all human, and from planet Earth, you can't be that adroit and separate your decision-making into hundredths of a second. Tenths of a second is difficult enough for us.
Are you done with everything you want to say?
Yes.
Okay.
Judge, are you mad?
Now I want to ask you my question, which is on that slide that was put up here when they said that he moved his finger to the receiver, Mr. Boyd had not yet pulled out his knives at that point. Isn't that right, sir?
In my opinion, he is in the business of pulling the knives out. He's in the act of pulling the knives out as he's putting his finger on the receiver and putting his finger from the receiver to the trigger, and the people are closing. It's all one. It's all one happening in about 0.2 of a second.
In the slide that was up in front of the jury, when he moved his finger to the receiver, Mr. Boyd had not yet pulled out his knives, had he, sir?
Your objection has an answer.
Sustained.
And then this thing about turning, that did you say that he turned because he got hit by the bullet? Is that what you were saying to the jury?
Are you asking me that?
Yeah, is that what you told this jury?
No.
Okay,
I
because
didn't.
he didn't turn because of the bullet, right, sir?
I have no idea why he turned.
Well, he turned
it-
he turned before he ever got shot, isn't that right?
To me, it appears that he is turning when he is The closest officer, and this is my opinion, is Officer Sandy. And Officer Sandy is about 12 feet away and coming up to gain a sight picture because he shoots ahead of Perez by a split second. And as he's making that decision and that movement, it appears to me that Boyd is looking right at him. So he sees the movement of Sandy and he starts to turn. And that's consistent with people who realize that they may be going to be shot. It's also consistent with somebody that's impacted. So I don't know why he turned.
Do you remember what my question was?
I thought I answered, but if I didn't, I apologize to you.
My question was simply, he actually turned to his left before he was shot. Isn't that right?
It's my understanding that that is probably the case.
And not only is it probably the case that you know that Defendant Sandy saw him turn to his left before he shot him. Isn't that right?
I believe so, but I'm not certain of that.
He said that in his statement, that he saw him turn to his left before he fired. Isn't that right, sir?
Okay.
And because Defendant Perez shot second, don't you believe that Defendant Perez would have seen him turn to his left as well?
It's not possible to know that from my perspective because it's impossible for the officer to see once they're focused over or in a apparatus, a sight picture, whether it's open sights or whether it's holographic sight, then you're limited as to what you can see. And officers, when they're engaged in shooting people, will not see them turning. So I don't know whether they could see that or they couldn't.
Okay. Your Honor, if I could put back on the Elmo, please. State's Exhibit 48. This is the picture before Mr. before Mr. Boyd is shot. You can see Mr. Boyd turning to his left there, sir. Can you see that on that picture? I'm trying to get this out of the glare, but this is before he's shot and he's turning to his left. Do you see that, sir?
I'm going to object to the lack of foundation for the question because that's not clear based on the still photo. The shot has not already been shot.
Let me direct him to a different. Let me direct him to a different thing anyway. When you said that Defendant Perez was looking through a sight, you're talking about this aim point sight right here. Isn't that right, sir?
Yes, but it would apply to any kind of sight.
But the aim point sight you are familiar with, are you not, sir?
Somewhat. I don't consider myself an authority on it, no.
You're aware that it doesn't provide any magnification?
No.
It is battery powered?
Yes.
It is something called a short tube sight?
Yes.
It has pieces of glass and mirrors in it. Does it not, sir?
I am sure it does, but I don't know exactly what it has in it.
How it works is it uses mirrors to project a red dot on your target, does it not?
I don't know how the red dot gets there.
And it is adjustable for brightness, different kinds of lighting circumstances, is it not?
The red dot?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And regardless of the brand or the quality of the sight, the experience of putting the dot on somebody is about the same, isn't that right?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
Yes, sir. Despite the brand or the quality of the sight, the experience of looking through the sight and putting a red dot on somebody is about the same. Is that right?
Objection, lack of foundation.
You can answer.
Putting the red dot on somebody is what officers are trained to do when they are trying to fire an accurate round at that person.
Yes, sir. And how it works is you look through it and you move it until a red dot is on your target. Isn't that right?
Yes.
The red dot can only be seen by you. It's invisible to the person on whom the red dot is put. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it's designed so you can use it with two eyes open. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And in fact, on the cover of your book, sir, there is a, if I can show this to the judge. There is a, is that the cover of your book, sir? Is that the cover of your book, Mr.
Yes,
McCarthy?
it is.
There is a fellow who is holding an M4 pattern AR-15 rifle, is that right?
Yes.
And on top of the rifle is an optic device?
It would appear so, and it would appear that he's holding an M4, but I don't know.
Okay, and it's a Tragicon Advanced Combat Optic Gun Sight.
I don't know. The publisher put the picture on there. I didn't.
All right. And in this picture on your book, sir, this fellow is shooting this with both eyes open, is he not, sir?
I don't know. I doubt that he's shooting at the cameraman, so he's probably looking at the cameraman.
You see that he's got both eyes open. I'm sorry, sir. You see that he's got both eyes open here, don't you, sir?
Yes, he's looking over the sight or around the sight, it would appear.
And
I don't know.
that's the way you're supposed to use that sight, isn't it? Isn't that right?
With both eyes open?
Yes, sir.
That depends on who you are. I can't. I have cross-dominant vision. Therefore, I have to close an eye.
Okay, unless you have cross-dominant vision, people are trained to shoot using the red dot sight with both eyes open. Is that right?
It's my understanding, yes.
And the best way to understand how the red dot sight works is to actually look through it yourself. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And when you look through it, you have to place it not up to your eye, but out in front of you, like it is on this rifle in this picture. Is that right?
Yes, I don't consider myself an expert on red dot sights, but
Yep.
yes, I'm familiar with that.
And I think you just said you don't know what Defendant Sandy would see because if he's looking through the sight, did you say that it might be fuzzy, or what did you say might happen there?
Judge, the lack of foundation, she's asking what Keith Sandy would see through, and there's no foundation.
I'm sorry. It wasn't Keith Sandy. I got the wrong defendant. You said you can't tell what you can't say that Defendant Perez would have seen him turning left because he was looking through an aim point sight. Is that what you said, sir?
Objection.
Oh, I'm sorry.
In fact, when you're looking using an aim point sight which sits out in front of you, you are able to make out color. Are you not, sir?
Objection, relevance.
You can see color through it, yes. You mean the color of a shirt, for example?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
You're able to see shapes, are you not, sir?
Yes.
You're able to see movement.
From what you're looking at through the sight.
Yes, sir.
You can see some movement, yes.
And in fact, it's important for you to be able to see because there may be people around you that you need to miss with your shot. Isn't that right, sir?
People around you,
Yes,
you
sir.
should miss with your shot?
Yes, sir. For example, in this particular situation, it would be useful for the person who's looking through the sight with both eyes open to realize there are two officers in front of him in addition to Mr. Boyd. Isn't that right?
Judge assumes facts, not evidence, that both eyes were open when Mr. Officer Perez was looking through this.
Okay. It is important to be able to, for someone who's shooting, to not hit the other officers who are at the scene. Is that right, sir?
Yes.
And what you can see is letters, if there are large letters. Can you see those through the sight, sir?
If that's what you're focused on, yes.
And what I'd like you to do, sir, is take the aim point sight.
May we approach her?
Yes. You don't know what Defendant Perez saw, do you, sir?
What he saw,
Yes, sir.
I know what I see in photos. When you say I don't know what he saw, I know he saw the mountain. I know he saw the subject. I know he saw other officers. I don't know what you mean.
And you know from the videotape that what Mr. Boyd did was to turn to his left and then turn around like this. Isn't that right, sir? You know from the video that's what happened.
Yeah, I know he turned to his left. I don't know the position of his arms or what he was doing after he turned to his left. He was now facing away.
And then you don't know from the video that his back was to Defendant Perez when he shot him?
He
It's
was.
actually a mischaracterization of the evidence, Your Honor.
I don't think so, Bill,
Right. Right? His back was to Defendant Perez when he shot him?
A round hit him in the back, so therefore his back was turned, yes.
All right. And you don't know what Defendant Perez saw as far as whether he saw this way I'm about 12 inches wide, this way I'm 4 inches wide, and then this way I'm 12 inches wide. Is that right, sir?
Okay.
All right. And so looking through a scope, since you can see movement and shape, you would see the shape of the person change, would you not, sir?
You may or may not. If you're focused on the red dot, for example, I'm focused on this microphone. I don't see the jury. I see them blurry. I see people, I know they're there. And I look up and I can see the individual people. If I go back and focus on this microphone, I don't see them.
Yes, sir, but if one
So
of them...
that's the same thing. When you're focused on the red dot, you're not going to see detail, in my opinion.
May I renew my request to do this demonstration?
same problem.
All right, Judge. Mr. McCarthy, even if you were looking at that microphone, and you would see these jurors move if they move, wouldn't you, sir? You see movement behind the microphone?
If I am focused over onto the red dot of the scope, I may or may not see the movement, and I have to see it and recognize it,
Yes, sir.
and then make a decision after I see it, recognize it. I have to make a decision based on the movement.
Yes, sir.
So all that compacted into what time frame?
And sir, if one side of a person had letters on them that said GAP, G-A-P, and you were looking through the red dot scope and you were focused on center mass, you'd see those letters, wouldn't you, sir?
You probably would.
And then when you turned, you wouldn't see the letters, would you, sir?
Am I preparing to fire now?
Yes, sir.
If I've made up my mind to shoot because you're a deadly threat, I have to now unmake up my mind to stop shooting. So therefore, I may not be able to stop the press once I've made the decision and you're turning at the same time. If that's all happening at the same time, you're going to get shot in the back.
Sir, one of the 3 or 4 cases, civil cases in which you actually testified for a civilian rather than the police, is one that is remarkably similar to this case. Is that right?
I don't know which one you're referring to.
Ronald Moore versus the City of Memphis, sir.
I haven't testified in it yet, but it's coming up, I guess.
And you've given a deposition in that case as of March 11th, 2015, have you not?
Yes.
And in that case, it involved sort of a loner hoarder who lived by himself, didn't it, sir?
Yes.
A person who was suffering from mental illness, is that right?
Yes.
And who they executed a warrant on his house for the crime of having too many animals, essentially, is that right?
Yes.
And the man, before the police went there, was described as angry and threatening, isn't that right?
Mr. Moore?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And his threats went on for over 4 months?
His what?
His threatening behavior went on for over 4 months.
Yes.
And he had a record, didn't he, sir?
No, he did not.
Okay.
'Cause
And
I don't recall that he had a record.
All right.
He had, the neighbors knew that he was emotionally disturbed and was a hoarder of animals and had about 25 cats and dogs,
Right.
25 each. So,
And he had a gun rather than a knife, didn't he, sir?
yes, he did.
And in that case, you testified against the police officers, did you not?
Yes.
You said you were critical of them because they were supposed to have not just a plan, but they were supposed to have a backup plan. Isn't that right?
I'd like to object at this point to relevance. It's such a collateral issue. I mean, this is more, I mean, if they want to try and impeach the witness, it should be fairly straightforward and simple rather than going into this case.
He's testified to something differently in a different case, Judge. That's
I'll give you some of it.
all right. Thank you. You criticized them, even though they had a plan, because they did not have a backup plan. Isn't that right, sir?
No. I did criticize them. May I explain why I criticized the police?
No, sir. I'm asking you about the backup plan now. Did you criticize them about not having a backup plan?
That's not my primary criticism, and that's not what the case is based on, so I won't agree with that.
All right.
I did say that because they had a plan, it was just goofy,
A goofy plan is what they had?
in my opinion.
And
They
you
had
also
a
said,
goofy-
I'm sorry, sir. Are
Never
you done?
mind.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
You also said under oath, and here's the point. You're supposed to plan and then say what happens if what I plan doesn't work. That's my fallback plan. What's my secondary plan? And I don't see that here. Isn't that what you testified, sir, under oath?
Yes.
And can you tell me what the backup plan or the secondary plan that Officers Sandy, Weimerskirch, and Ingram had?
Sure. Number one, they had verbalization as their first step. They had time and utilized time as the second step. They put in place 3 less lethal alternatives that they had hoped would work as a third step. As a fourth step, they gave him verbal commands after they initiated the 3 less lethal situation, 3 less lethal alternatives. They gave him verbal commands as they closed to try to take him into custody. And then they used deadly force when he threatened them with deadly force.
Sir, you were aware that they were told in advance that their taser shotgun might not work because of the clothing he'd put on?
Yes, that's the case everywhere that those kinds of tools are used.
And before they went up there, they had talked about themselves that they couldn't use the taser and the dogs at the same time?
Objection, mischaracterization. The evidence, Your Honor, it's argument evidence. It's not facts that are not evidence.
Were you aware, I'm sorry, Judge.
Go ahead.
Were you aware that Sergeant Weimerskirch said to both Ingram and Sandy that if we use the taser and it doesn't work, we can't use the dog? Were you aware of that, sir?
No.
You criticized the officers at Memphis and the Memphis Police Department for being undermanned for what they were doing as far as the entry into the place. Isn't that right, sir?
I believe so.
And they had 10 officers to 1 person, is that right?
There were 10 officers there. There wasn't 10 officers to confront the subject. There was a smaller number. They made an entry with, I believe, 3 officers, as I recall.
They used a distraction device, a flashbang that didn't work with that man, isn't that right?
They used 4.
And you said in that case that their dynamic entry, which is what they were trying to approach him, rather, right? Isn't that correct? I'm
Yes.
sorry. Was confrontational and can get your officers killed, and it can wind up in a shooting that you wouldn't have if you didn't do it. Isn't that right, sir?
In context with the situation, the suspect had committed no act of violence other than cruelty to animals. That was what the warrant was for. And so my criticism primarily was we don't use a SWAT team to serve a warrant for cruelty to animals, and especially on somebody who is emotionally disturbed without ever trying to talk to them or wait till he left the house. So there was a lot more in this than what you're asking me.
Yes, sir. And in that case, the officer claimed that the man had pointed a gun at him and he'd shot him when the man pointed a gun at him. Is that right?
The officer said that, yes.
And you did not believe that?
I questioned it.
Because, and the reason you questioned it was the trajectory of the bullets. Isn't that right, sir?
Based on where the rounds impacted the subject, it isn't consistent with the usual shooting position.
Yes, sir. How the rounds impacted the subject is they all came from right to left across the subject's body. Isn't that right?
That's where they impacted him, yes.
And so you testified that you didn't believe that the man was confronting the officer at the time he was shot. Is that right?
I said that's not the usual position most people, when they're shooting a handgun, are in. But it is possible that he was in that position. But I didn't think it was probable.
In that case, you suggested several other approaches to that situation. Did you not, sir, that would have been better?
Yes.
Something called a takedown away?
Yes, take down away, which would be the first and the best option.
That is to wait for him to come out of his house and try to arrest him outside of his house?
Yes, when he goes to the store, when he leaves.
The second one was to surround and call out the man?
Yes,
You said that was safer than a dynamic entry, isn't that right?
yes,
In that case, you would surround him with officers and try to call him out of the house, is that right?
yes. And if he failed to come, you'd use chemical agents to force him to surrender.
That's like tear gas. You would throw tear gas and get him to come out.
Yes.
Okay. Was it Safariland that you worked for as a trainer in consulting?
Yes. And I also work with the National Tactical Officers Association and state associations to put on training.
And then in addition to that, you make money as an expert witness too, sir?
Yes,
You do about 6 or 7 cases a year on average?
yes,
Make about $60,000 or $70,000 a year in additional income as an expert witness, is that right?
yes.
Give me 1 second, Your Honor. I think I'm done, Your Honor. Thanks. Yes, yes, Your Honor. Let me gather them all up. No, I will not. It's not an exhibit. Nope, I will not. Because I didn't use it, because you objected to it, so I will not. I didn't put it up, Judge. They objected, and it wasn't displayed. Let me get.
What's that?
It was withdrawn.
Right.
That's correct,
fine.
Judge.
Yeah.
Wait, Judge, I forgot something. I'm sorry, Judge. Since Lewis hasn't started, may I finish? I'm sorry, Judge. I apologize, Mr. McCarthy. I had
No problem.
just a couple more things to ask you. And Judge, I'm going to use the Elmo too. You became a member of the SWAT team in Los Angeles in 1971, is that right, Mr. McCarthy?
Late 71, temporarily, and then January 72. permanently.
And that was sort of the birth of the SWAT team, wasn't it, sir?
More or less, it started in 1966 in concept, and then eventually became a full-time regular SWAT team in '71.
And it was originally created to deal with what people thought was a time of civil unrest in the 60s and 70s. Isn't that right?
That was one of the primary motivators, yes.
Okay, and the SWAT team was assigned when you were there to confront what police believed were militant organizations at the time. Is that right?
That, and to provide high ground security for patrol officers during unusual occurrence, crowd control, riotous events.
Okay, and that was some of the militant organizations that you were dealing with were the pro-African American group known as the Black Panthers,
Yes,
and the pro-Chicano movement known as the Brown Berets,
yes.
and the anti...
Subject to relevance, Your Honor, beyond the scope.
Okay, that was a time before video cameras or cell phones which could record police encounters. Is that right, Mr.
Objection,
McCarthy? I think it goes to bias, Your Honor, and if you will give me some leeway, I can develop the bias here, like in 3 questions. Okay, yes. It was a time of less supervision over the police, is that right?
Objection.
I'm giving you 3 questions.
Okay.
A time of what?
Less supervision over police because there weren't people with cell phones and cameras, is that right?
Supervision of police was very good at that time. Cell phones, things like that obviously didn't exist, so there wasn't impromptu video of police activity, you're right.
And are you one of those officers who wish we could go back to those days when police officer decisions were not questioned?
No, I bought my grandson, who's an LA County Sheriff, a body camera, and they still haven't issued him, so he's got one.
Okay. And you don't have any problem with jurors or civilians reviewing the behavior of police officers?
No, and I have no problem with body cameras. I highly recommend them. I think that they should be part of the police equipment when police officers are in the street.
Okay, and you
There's more than
should.
3, Your Honor.
This is the last one, Judge.
That was 3.
That's right, Judge. But this is what I'm leading up to. This is something different than what he says in his training. Sure, Judge. This is his last training video. Thank you, Mr. McCarthy.
Oh, wait, you're not done yet, sir.
Oh, gosh, no, I'm sorry.
I'm the one who always disappoints. I apologize.
I was getting ready to drive back to Flagstaff. I'm sorry.
Podium HDMI, with your permission. I'm going to move this video forward slowly, and then I'm going to ask you a question that was asked of you by Ms. McGinn, and that is the question with regards to when Mr. Boyd withdrew his knives in relationship to the time that Officer Perez moves his finger from the frame of the weapon to the trigger.
I couldn't see. Did it just move? I couldn't see.
Okay, let's try that again. I should back up a little bit more.
And it appeared that his finger moved there?
Yes.
Yes.
So based on what you're able to review, is it fair to say that Mr. Boyd had withdrew his knives from his pockets before Officer Perez moved his finger from the frame to the trigger?
Objection, leading, both the whole process has been leading because he didn't see it initially, had to ask Mr. Robles whether that's what was happening. And also this question is leading, Judge.
I do agree that it seems like the witness was reacting to your prompting, so if you could just play the video.
Based on your review of the videotape, would you please explain to the jury the sequence of events with regards to Mr. Boyd raising his knives and Officer Perez moving his finger from the frame of the weapon to the trigger?
In what I'm seeing, and I thought I saw the movement to the trigger, I wasn't sure I'd have some eyesight problems, obviously. So the finger moved to the trigger, and what I'm seeing is Mr. Boyd in an assaultive mode with knives in his hands.
Those are my questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Gregg?
Yes. Briefly, sir, probably have more now than I did on direct, but just a couple. Do you understand that she's the prosecutor for the state of New Mexico?
Yes.
Okay. Did you hear in her question her trivialize the 7 deaths of officers by knives?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Are those 7 officers that she pointed out that died by knives, are those officers' lives important as well?
In my opinion, yes, sir.
Does that reinforce the fact that knives are dangerous?
Yes, it does.
So basically, what I heard was that you're testifying against, in another case, a civil case, you are testifying against an officer that you think did wrong. Is that right?
Objection, leading, and all of these questions are leading, Your Honor.
Okay, I'll rephrase. Who are you testifying for in that civil case which she was discussing?
I'm testifying on behalf of the family of Mr. Moore and against the police officer who shot Mr. Moore.
Okay. And just to be clear, to make sure there's, one more thing. Is there a difference between the use of less lethal uses of force in the dynamic within a house as opposed to in the field like the foothills?
A very significant difference.
And what are those differences, sir?
Cactus, for one. And, the situation in residences, it can be constricted, limited space, clutter that can take place. Or it can be something more spacious, like a school or a business, outside, and in the area where this event occurred, that was incredibly difficult for anybody to maneuver, and very hard. If it were at night, trying to use a flashlight to see the suspect and to see where you're going would be virtually impossible. You couldn't do 2 things at once. It was very difficult.
And one last thing, just to make sure there's no confusion, you haven't been paid a penny for this case, have you?
No, I
Judge,
haven't.
asked and answered a bunch.
Sustained, once before I think, but before we relieve the witness, let me have counsel go through
Mr. McCarthy, you said, I think when I ended, that you don't have any problem with jurors reviewing the actions of police officers. From your PowerPoint presentation, sir, we pulled the last slide that you use in your training on use of force, and God, if you can put on that video, Judge, or the Elmo one. Okay. This slide is the last slide that you show your officers in that training program, and it shows here a tank with a person on top of the tank, and it's entitled Fog of War. And the last slide you use in your training to police officers says, only those that have put their life on the line get to second guess a soldier in the field. Isn't that what you train your officers, sir?
Yes, I have a slide that says that. It's the last one, and then of course there's about 5 minutes of instruction that goes with that.
Okay, thank you, Judge. That's all I have.
Mr. Robles, do you have anything on?
You mentioned that there's 5 minutes of instruction. If you could summarize that 5 minutes of instruction, would you please explain to the jury why the concept of fog of war is a relevant and important concept to communicate to law enforcement officers?
Yes. To make an honest and accurate decision about a person's actions when they're confronted with life-threatening situations or very stressful circumstances. I often use a traffic situation as an example. We're going down I-25, everything's fine, and then all of a sudden a wheel comes off a semi and goes in front of your car, and you slam on the brakes and you're spinning and people are maneuvering, and when that happens, where is our heart rate, and what are we feeling? Our physical and psychological circumstance under that kind of an unexpected event or life-threatening event. And maybe the tire misses us, and so do all the cars. And we usually wind up taking a deep breath, and we talk about it when we get home and say, you can't believe what happened on the I-25 today. And so I use practical circumstances like that and talk about when something is dynamic and it is threatening, that it does create a fog. And the fog is similar to the fog of war, which is an old military term that comes from the Civil War. And that is that under those kinds of circumstances, it's very difficult to function and do everything that you would hope you would do. And that's how I use that. And I think there's a connection with the real world, ordinary people, and police officers and firemen the same way. We all have been in that circumstance where we're startled and scared.
In your opinion, how does the concept of fog of war apply to the incident involving James Boyd?
Very simply, the officers are under tremendous stress and pressure. They're responsible for the life of the officers, their long cover. That responsibility means that they have to make a very difficult decision in a very short period of time, very possibly. And that long cover position, coupled together with all of the circumstances that begin to evolve when the distraction device goes off, and officers aren't immune to the sound and the noise of a distraction device. They also will hear it. They've heard it a lot of times before, so it'll have less effect on them than it would on any ordinary person by a mile. But all of it is part of what is termed there the fog of war, the pressure, the circumstances, and I would use, if I could, The officers are rope officers, special weapons and tactics officer, very well trained, and the requirements of the Department of Albuquerque PD is that they are very accurate shooters. There were some misses here. Officers missed under the stress and pressure of this situation. All of their rounds, even though they had a rifle, and one is only 29 feet away and one is only 12 feet away, we had misses. That's the fog of war.
I'd ask that he asked a question rather than doing
Would you please provide an example of the fog of war using the fact in this case that certain rounds were missed when they were fired?
Say that last few words, I didn't hear it.
Now the question, what I'm trying to do is to elicit the testimony you gave before with a question. So the question is this: would you please explain the fog of war using the officer's misses in this case to explain it?
Okay. When the officers are in a standby position in long cover as verbalization is taking place, and that's not a relaxed position. It's a standby position, and they realize that they may or may not have to do something. Then the situation unfolds. The fog of war begins because all of a sudden we have a lot of activity, and the deadly force cover officers, the long cover officers, are now in a position where they know they have to make a decision to shoot or not shoot. And I think I mentioned earlier, 10% of officers can't even use deadly force. So what happens now is that the activity, how fast it's unfolding, trying to see the subject and the officers and what the subject, Mr. Boyd, is doing and what the officers and their proximity to Mr. Boyd is, all of that creates a tremendous amount of pressure, and that would be, quote, the fog of war. And for them to have the ability to do what they did under those kinds of circumstances is very difficult.
May I take a moment to confer? Those are my questions, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you. You have a question? Sure. You have a question from the chair? Council, any further?
I have a question for you. Based on your experience, is it proper procedure to have the lethal cover deploy non-lethal means during an arrest plan?
To have lethal cover deploy non-lethal means?
So let me read it again just to be clear. Based on your experience, is it proper procedure to have the lethal cover deploy non-lethal means during an arrest plan?
If the officer is trained and qualified, certified to do both, then he can play both those roles and have both those tools.
So if an officer is trained and certified to deploy a flashbang, for instance, is it also proper for that officer to continue to serve as a cover officer with a deadly force or with a firearm?
Yes, officers, it's not unusual to multitask and to be able to do 2 or 3 things. To breach a door with a breaching tool, and then to make an entry as a part of an entry team, and then to engage in some activity inside. So that's not uncommon with police officers, field police officers, or narcotics officers, or SWAT officers.
And I believe that question's been asked.
Okay. Thank you for your testimony today, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor.
May I approach?
We'll go ahead and take a recess until 5 minutes before. Please stand for the jury.